Jeremy. So I'm Giles Blackburn from the Business Confucius Institute at the University of Leeds. Welcome to this webinar and talk with Jeremy Sargent, which we're delivering in collaboration with the Confucius Institute at the University of Manchester. So we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Jeremy Sargent today. He's been living, working and operating in China as a lawyer and entrepreneur for over 20 years. Jeremy graduated from the University of Leeds with a bachelor's degree in Chinese. And during his epic journey in China, he's also been awarded an OBE in recognition of his contribution to British business and legal services in China. Amongst other things, Jeremy is also the chairman of the British Chamber of Commerce in Guangdong, and also honorary legal advisor to the British Consulate General in Guangzhou. So just from that brief taste of what Jeremy's up to and what he's been recognized for, can we see that there's lots of valuable experience and insight to share with us all. So before the pandemic, we were planning to bring Jeremy to both Leeds and Manchester for some in-person events. But of course, this hasn't worked out. And by the miracle of technology, Jeremy is now joining us from New Zealand, where it's 10 p.m. in the evening. So thank you for staying up so late, Jeremy. The idea is that Jeremy will present for around 30 or 40 minutes. And then this will give us some time for some Q&A with a view to finishing on time at about 12 o'clock. You can post questions in the comments box. And I'll share either the specific questions or some key themes that come through with Jeremy. Apologies if we don't get to them all. There's quite a few people joining us today. And at the end of the seminar, we'll be posting a feedback form in the comments box as well. So if you're able to give us some feedback for today, that would be great. So thank you everybody for joining. We've heard that we've got people from all over the place, including Cambodia, which is great. Without further ado, I think I'll pass over to Jeremy. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you, Giles. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Really delighted to be here. And I'm in New Zealand at the moment as a consequence of this lockdown and the border restrictions. So I'm not going anywhere for now. I could be in a much worse place, though, having said that. It's beautiful here. Before I start, I'd like to say a very heartfelt word of thanks to Giles and Francis and TAIPEI, and of course to the University of Leeds and University of Manchester Confucius Institutes for helping to organize this and for hosting me. As Giles mentioned, originally I was going to be there in person, but for obvious reasons, none of us can get on planes very easily at the moment. So we're here as a global session, which is very exciting. So I will start by going back in time and just sharing a photo, just to lighten the mood a bit before we start. So that was me in 1966, and that's obviously, like most people, that's how their life began. And then I suppose one of those big defining moments in your life happened to me in 1978, and that's when my father was posted for a 3-month contract to Hong Kong. And so the whole family got on a plane and went to Hong Kong in 1978 with no intention of staying. It was a 3-month posting. It was a project that he was working on. But you know how these things go for many of us, and 3 months soon becomes 6 months, which then becomes a year, and then the rest becomes history. And in a sense, that's what happened to me. So my first encounters with the Far East and anything Chinese really was back in '78. I can still remember arriving at the old Kai Tak airport. Some of you on the call no doubt will remember it too. I've included a couple of photos of the planes landing, but that wall of heat that hit me when we got off the plane back in 1978, I can feel it as if it was yesterday. Now, while I was in Hong Kong, I started to develop a very keen interest in Chinese language. So I used to sit copying subtitles off the TV, and I assume my stroke order was terrible, but I I probably mastered 100 characters when I was age 12, just by learning and the pictures. And I thought it was absolutely amazing and brilliant. And back in 1978, to be honest, China was a mystery. It was a mysterious place that no one really went and no one really left. And this is as close to China as you'd really get back then. And that's the border. And if you look at the picture, that was what SHENZHEN looked like back in 1978. And that was the border crossing. And not many people would cross that border, the lucky few. And so it was always this sense of mystery. What's it like on the other side of the fence, so to speak? And tourists used to go to the mountains of Hong Kong just to get their binoculars and look over. So for me, this is really where the interest in China sparked and came. Now, I was originally looking at studying engineering in the footsteps of my dad. But just before I packed off to Bristol University, my father said to me, he said, Jeremy, it's probably easier, I think he said something like this, it's probably easier to teach a Mandarin speaker engineering than it is to teach an engineer Mandarin. And if you look what's about to happen in China, you know, if you like languages, which I did, have you thought about perhaps giving it a go and doing it properly and going in to study Chinese? So it was a bit of a shock coming from my dad, who was always very pro technology and engineering and fixing cars and this type of thing. But I thought about it, and the long and short is I ended up at Leeds University with 30 or so of my colleagues in the classmates in the department. That was in the 80s, and in 87 we did our year in China, Shanghai in 87, which again, some of you may have been around then in China, but you know, obviously a totally different place than it is today. And it was a really amazing year, spent studying the language, and perhaps more importantly in a way, traveling the length and breadth of China as a student on a very small budget. But that meant hitchhiking on trucks and buses and trains and hard seats for 3 days and this type of thing. I actually dug out this letter. I was just clearing through old rubbish not long ago, and I found a letter that I wrote to my parents back in, the date is April 87. And in that letter, I actually say to my parents, you know, the best decision I think I've made in recent years was the decision to take an unconventional sort of study route and to come and learn Chinese at a time when very few people did it. And not only that, when you told people you were studying Chinese, you got this look of bewilderment and often accompanied by some kind of semi-joke about opening restaurants or this or that. So it was an interesting time, but from the experiences in Hong Kong, I just felt that there had to be something in it. And so there I was in 87, and the proud recipient of my degree in 1990 from Leeds. 4 brilliant years, including the year in China, absolutely wonderful. As one does when one graduates, well, many of us didn't really know what I wanted to do. So I spent some time kind of working in bars and restaurants and selling those dolphin posters on the streets of London, running from the police, this type of thing for quite a while, figuring out what to do. Ended up going to Taiwan, and again, a week became 2 weeks, it became a year. And at that point, it was probably time to get a career going. I was in my mid-20s by then, and it was fun, and I was having a great time, but I wasn't really going very far in terms of a career. And as my friends from university were racing ahead, I started feeling maybe it's about time to be a bit more serious and do something a little bit more serious for now. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea, but I figured you could do this law conversion called the CPE. It's a 1-year conversion course. And so I ended up coming back to Leeds actually, Leeds Beckett, which was then known as Metropolitan, and doing the 1-year conversion. and so on. So I didn't particularly enjoy studying law. From the freedom of living in Taiwan and traveling and everything else, going back as an impoverished student was tough in a way, but I stuck at it. Applied for jobs, and you know, to become a lawyer, you need to do a 2-year contract. Very competitive to get a training contract. So I sent out the letters and the interviews and so on, but you know, as always, many rejections. But then a job offer came in 1995. Now, a really important point there was, to be honest, and I'll be open and honest, based on my academic background, I should not have got this job. But because I'd had the degree in Mandarin and the experience of living in China, this firm, Stevenson Harwood, decided to create an extra trainee position. And as they put it, I was a bit of an unknown quantity. I wasn't your kind of typical, you know, LLB kind of law students, and I got the place in the firm. And so that was really the beginning of 10, 12 years with the firm, which, you know, I look back at with the fondest of memories. After I qualified, you need to do your articles for 2 years. After qualification, I was then offered the opportunity to go to Guangzhou. And again, this was meant to be maximum 1 year. My boss, Michael, at the time, he said to me, he said, Jeremy, we're opening an office up in China. And this was a time when no one really wanted to go to Guangzhou, to be honest. And he said, you know, would you be willing to, quote, go up north, young man, see what you can do, report back, you know, it sounded like the old empire or something. That was my brief. And I thought, okay, good opportunity, great chance to actually start using some of the language skills I've learned. So off I went. And, you know, I spent, like I said, about 10 years in Guangzhou, and then we opened in Shanghai. And, you know, obviously having the language made a huge difference, particularly turning up back then in a place where there were very few foreign nationals. And it was totally different than today in communication, a lot of running around and rolling up your sleeves. But, and it was a challenge. You know, I knew nothing about Chinese law. So you turn up working for a law firm as a newly qualified lawyer, but you don't know anything about the law. Kind of embarrassing. And I remember being in the odd meeting where I found that a real, that feeling where you want your chair to swallow you up. You know, a new client walks in and asks you a pretty basic question, and there was me scratching my head. You know, I'll get back to you next week on that if that's okay. But that being said, being one of, I think, 2 Western lawyers in Guangzhou back then, at a time when, you know, back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when many foreign companies, manufacturers, big projects were kind of pouring into China, the real nuts and bolts, greenfield FDI work. So I was lucky, I sort of caught that wave, but it was a huge learning process, a very steep learning curve. And, you know, what I learned there is sometimes you just jump into these things and you roll up your sleeves and you just get stuck in and see what happens. And a lot of people at the time said this is a career suicide. And, you know, lawyers are very competitive, and it's all about how many years qualified you are and who your partner is supervising you is, and so on. So, whereas I was out there on my own, kind of building something slowly, very slowly to begin with, and wondering whether this was the right move from a career point of view. But then I thought, just go for it. And slowly but surely, it took a couple of years for the wheels to begin turning, and the odd little inquiry became a small job. And then somehow I improvised my way, and we recruited a few people and slowly started building traction. And so within 3 or 4 years, we were really motoring along and expanding the office. And as I mentioned, we applied for a license in Shanghai, and I was commuting backwards and forwards between Guangzhou and Shanghai, which was, you know, a really interesting time. Learned a ton of things. I mean, you know, the legal environment. People always ask me, you know, what's law in China all about? And, you know, I could sit all evening and talk about that. I think one thing that often bewilders, especially back then, new entrants and foreign companies in the market was the extent to which China is essentially a mass of administrative regulations. So I've said to many clients, you know, the chances of you seeing a courtroom in China, especially back then, are pretty small. The chances of you having to deal with local government, whether it's on your street level, and in my business, we literally do every day, or the city level, or the provincial level, or if you're in certain types of project, even national level, central government, you will be dealing with government all the time. And so that relationship between you as a foreign investor and, if you like, the state, the government, is something that for many people, it took some getting used to. And so part of my job really was to unravel that and make sense of it and make the journey smoother and make things happen. So in terms of, for example, applying for approvals and licenses and drafting contracts. And, you know, being a lawyer in China meant you had to really improvise it to an extent. When I say improvise, I mean, you had to sort of step out of your comfort zone and do all sorts of things that you probably wouldn't do if you were sitting in a big law firm in London, for example. And I'm not talking about dodgy things, you know, getting on planes and going into the middle of nowhere to meet a prospective Chinese joint venture partner. Lack of transparency, conflicting regulations. This was always an issue because often, and I think nowadays, and especially with sort of technology and the way things have evolved generally in terms of commercial law in China. But back then, it was a real patchwork. So it was a bit like peeling an onion. Someone would ask you a question and you would have to start, well, what does the national law, is there a national law on this? And then you'd have to work your way down the layers, and it could be right down to your street level. And what you sometimes found is contradictions, differences in interpretation, sometimes blatant contradictions in the rules. And to explain that to a client who had operated in London, for example, or in the UK, or in fact in many countries, was really, you know, a very interesting part of the job, in fact. And that's, I suppose, where we could add the most value, particularly back then. I mean, things absolutely have changed. I think people sometimes have a slightly over-egged sense of how murky and non-transparent it all is. In my experience, dealing with the legal bureaucracy in China, provided you were patient and you went down the path you were meant to, and you dealt with the authorities in the way you were meant to, and you dotted the I's and crossed the T's as you were meant to, then by and large, you got to where you wanted to. And that was one of the very positive things about the whole foreign investment regime in China going back till the early 80s. The Chinese government had been extremely pragmatic in whether it was setting up whole special economic zones or economic, smaller investment zones and so on, and streamlining and refining and making it an easier and easier process. So while I'm not for 1 minute saying it was all plain sailing and easy, what I can say is in 20 years, I've not seen an application for a license that's been rejected without good reason. So it's not, I never found it this sort of world of dark rooms and people in green suits behaving very arbitrarily. Hasn't been my experience. And nowadays, absolutely not. But even back in those old days. So that was, I mean, I could obviously talk, lots of case studies and lots of stories about the years working as a lawyer in China with a big law firm, met fabulous clients. I met Giles back in those days and CBBC and worked on projects all over the country. And I think, being able and willing to roll up my sleeves and dive in meant, frankly, that I could get exposure to the types of clients that probably if I had stayed in London or even Hong Kong, it would have been much more difficult. I was able to punch above my weight working with Coca-Cola and Diageo and lots of big companies who really needed that hand-holding in those early days in China. So it was a win-win situation. But, and some of you this may resonate with, yeah, so I've said made a few points here. But in 2007, you know, I was around 40, and I was just getting this niggling sense of where does life go from here. It was very comfortable. I was very happy, and I'm sure some of the people on this webinar are probably feeling a similar thing in their life. We reach a point, whether it's career or otherwise, but in this case, I'm talking about my career, where everything was great and I was happy, but I knew deep down inside that I wasn't content. I wasn't genuinely fulfilled by this. And, you know, I liken it in a way to being, the analogy I've used before is, I felt like I was on a train which was on predetermined tracks, and being a partner in a law firm and busy and expanding, but I knew exactly where that was going. And that was the thing. And I could not steer that train. It was on these tracks, and I could see each station as it came up. And I also knew, frankly, to be honest, and this sounds a little bit cynical, but I knew at the end of my journey, I would get off that train, somebody else would get on at the end station, and that would be the end of me. I'd be forgotten about in 5 minutes. And I'm sorry to say it, but that's sort of how the corporate world tends to work, in my opinion. So, so this is where this idea of perhaps becoming a bit more entrepreneurial. We all talk about, or many of us talk about, we'd love to start our own thing and be our own boss and have our own business. And I've been thinking about this for a while. And I remember the day I just put the phone down to my brother, William, who lives in Hong Kong. And he said to me, Jeremy, if I hear you mention this once more, I'm not talking to you. After you put the phone down, you send an email to your boss and you resign, because I'm sick of hearing this from you. And I finished the call, put the phone down, and, you know, embarrassed to say I didn't phone or travel down to Hong Kong. My boss was in Hong Kong, but I did send that email saying, look, I've made this big decision. After the email had left, honestly, I just felt this sense of, a bit of apprehension, but also, yes, this was the right thing to do. And that was a really powerful feeling. And, you know, I know this is corny, cliche, cheesy, whatever. We hear this stuff all the time. But, you know, my best entrepreneurial advice is to start, absolutely. It's obvious. We meet people, we've done it ourselves every day. You know, have you thought about doing this, or I could do that? And I've been doing the same thing. But that email was the start. And I had a 6-month notice period to serve. So I did have time to plan. And so I left the firm, set up on my own as a kind of legal consulting business, carried on really where I'd left off in many respects, and became my own boss. It was highly liberating. You're no longer on that train. You're on the deck of you're on the deck. I say deck. You're actually on a little boat, just you and maybe one other person. You're rowing away. But the point there is you're not on the tracks. You can kind of go where you like. And if you see somewhere nice to stop, you can stop there. And you can let people on who you want to be on that boat with you. But the point is you're steering it. And for me, that process was lonely. It was stressful. It was challenging. And all the other cliches everyone uses when it comes to setting up on your own. But it was highly liberating. And being in China made it particularly exciting because there was a real feeling of pioneering, because especially in Guangzhou, there are not that many foreign sort of entrepreneur people who are doing their own thing. I mean, there are more and more, but you're still in a fairly small circle. So there was definitely a feeling of excitement of going into uncharted waters. Then we forward a couple more years, and this was to 2009, and I was actually having dinner with my wife, and who had been working in a media company in China. She's from China, from Wuhan, in a media company for 9 years, and she was on the cusp of leaving, and she's a graphic designer, and she wanted to do something else, and blah, blah, blah. So we had one of those romantic conversations about, oh, maybe we can find a little coffee shop and set up a little coffee shop together, and you make coffee and I carry on in the office doing legal work and so on, and see where it goes. So we were having that conversation over dinner, and we went downstairs after dinner, and it so happened across the road, we found there was a new building with little units, retail units, and in true China fashion, we had to duck and dive and jump through a million hoops, but we managed to get 3 of these small units for our coffee shop. Roll on a little bit longer, and we thought, well, actually, a coffee shop's a bit boring. There's coffee shops opening everywhere, tea shops and coffee shops. Let's do a good bar. And so that's when, that's when we opened our first Happy Monk. That's a picture of it, still there, as a kind of gastro pub, I guess you call it. Now, we were headless chickens, and everybody says, don't go into hospitality and don't go into F&B, and whatever you do, don't go into bars. That was sort of the pearls of wisdom that I got when we started. And in the beginning, like anything, particularly with no experience, no business plan, no real plan, other than just to open and see what happens, this is what we did. And a friend of hers helped us on the design, and we found a guy who could kind of make nice pizzas, and we got started. And to be honest, why have we stayed in business for over 10 years at the Happy Monk now? I mean, lots and lots of reasons, which I'll come on to, but so that was 2009. Now, we waited 5 years to open our second location, also in Guangzhou. We call it Happy Monk 2, which is still going. That's on 2, as you can see, on 2 levels there. A bit later, a year later, we opened our Happy Monk 3. And then in 2017, we opened Happy Monk 4, right in the middle of town. That's our biggest location up until then. And Happy Monk 5 opened, that's our most recent one, it's a cool location by the Pearl River. It's on 2 levels. We've got an upper deck. This is the upper deck, and then a downstairs area. And you'll notice, from the pictures, most of the customers we attract are local Chinese, mainly millennials, but different age groups. And people often say, how have you managed to keep in business for that long, in a very competitive market, in a tough industry? And I think there are. This is part of our team that we work with, and this is really sort of wrapping up my talk in a way. But from the last 20 years in China, the things that I've learned, and I stress this is just very subjective. I'm not here to tell anyone how they should or shouldn't set up business or live or work in China. So this is very, very subjective, but quite a few things that I found. And the first one, and some of this sounds obvious, absolutely, China is full of opportunity, but it's a very difficult market, and it's so important not to go into China with this idea that I still see today with clients and so on. This idea that the streets are made of gold, and everyone can reach this bonanza and make £1 million. It doesn't work like that. I think the market in China, especially if you're starting small, which most of us are, if you're an SME or an individual, it's a bit different if you're a huge multinational. But for the SMEs and for the individuals, it's all about persevering and patience and being willing to commit the time and the resources. And again, that sounds obvious, and you may turn around and say, well, isn't that the same everywhere? I think it is, but I think in China, given the complexities of geography, of language, of distribution channels, I mean, in our bar business, the people who sell us beverages, alcoholic beverages, soft drinks, you know, whether it's Coca-Cola or Carlsberg beer or spirits or food or anything, it is such a complex supply chain. Just understanding who's who has distribution rights for where, who owns the brand, and so on and so on. You need to do a lot of due diligence in itself. So really trying to understand and get to the nub of the market you're looking for. And again, you know, apologies if I'm stating the obvious, but there is often a perception that China is this big market, and it's China. Well, actually, China is thousands of small or big or medium-sized, interlocking, separate, horizontal, vertical, and so on. Lots and lots of different markets and segments. It's in the alcohol business, it's probably the most complex market on earth. And understanding that and working out where you're going to position yourself and what is your USP, what's your selling point, and why are you going to be better than your competitors in a hugely competitive market. People in China are very entrepreneurial. Everybody wants to start a business, whether it's buying and selling on WeChat upwards. And we see this, a lot of our team members, they run little side things and so on. So understanding really carefully what you're trying to achieve, what is your segment, what is your market is invaluable. And so many clients and friends and people that I know and have seen have come to China, crashed, burnt, and leave very demoralized. And then, you know, everything's about how difficult China is, how no one can be trusted, how the market has no transparency, how everyone's out to shaft you, and so on and so on. That's a message that's propagated a lot. And yes, of course, those things all happen. But my experience has been somewhat different, and working with, whether it's our suppliers, our landlords, our team, our employees, and so on, the types of problems that I just mentioned, I mean, touch wood, maybe we've been lucky, but I've not found those to be significant challenges to the business. I mentioned, you know, China is very competitive, sophisticated. The old days of being able to bring in a foreign concept or a Western brand or so on and expect some traction, I think those days are pretty much gone. You need to, you know, the young generation of Chinese consumers are super savvy. They know what they like, they know what's going on in the world, and they probably have traveled to many parts of the world. So they want things which are new and which are very much tailored to their needs. And we see this in our bar business when it comes to the food, the drinks, the detail. We have to be very, very much on our toes at all times to meet that demand and to keep ahead of it. I was liken it to, you know, running, and this would apply everywhere, but in a very dynamic market, I always say, you know, when you run up an escalator, we've all done that when we were little. So an escalator's coming down and you're running up. You need to run pretty fast just to get to the top. And it feels a bit like that sometimes. The minute you stop, the minute you slow down to the speed that the escalator is moving backwards, you start going backwards. So even if you match that speed, you stand still. So you always need to be ahead of that slightly. I've already mentioned point 3 here. So this isn't, you know, particularly related to anything specific about China in itself, but in my case, obviously, this has all happened in China. But, you know, going from an employee and working in a big law firm, which was a wonderful job, great colleagues, lovely firm, you know, I miss them, but that sense of liberation to finally not have to worry about applying for annual leave, not having to answer to anybody about what time you do this or that, and being able to make your own decisions is just brilliant. And as we've grown, we now have a team of almost 200 people. And as we've grown, particularly in the China context, and particularly in a business like ours, which frankly, to be honest, food and beverage and catering and bars and restaurants aren't very sexy in China. They're really considered pretty much the thing you go to if you can't find anything else to do. And so, you know, what that means, being frank, is we get people walking in off the, I mean, literally walking in off the streets. In many cases, not particularly well educated. Some will have left school age 14 or 16, grown up in the villages, no English, no travel experience, often not a great deal of self-confidence. And bringing people like that into you know, what I call the big family, really, and building and nurturing, that's been an incredibly rewarding and enjoyable process. And if there's one thing that gets me out of bed each morning for work, and it probably is that. My point 4, I think most business schools, and I've just finished a course where it's all about planning and Excels and goals and targets and budgets. What I've personally found is I don't get too wrapped up in that stuff. What I tend to do is work out the general direction you want to go in and just get on with it, but focus on every day. I liken it a little bit to, and I know, you know, this really probably goes down to personality, and, you know, some people like to be planned and others don't. But I liken it a little bit to, you know, going on holiday as a backpacker to Europe. You know, I was not the person who would book the whole trip and book every hotel three months ahead. I would tend to arrive and often book my first hotel once I'd got off the train or plane or whatever, and just sort of see where the journey took me. Obviously, you need some basic strategy and direction. I'm not for one second saying being completely aimless and having no sense of direction is good. I'm also not saying for 1 minute having no plans and targets and budgets and rules is good either. But what I've found is not being too focused on those things has actually enabled me and our team to focus on the things that really, to me, matter. And that is creating an experience, whether it's for your staff, your team, or for your customers, that adds value. Hence, you have a sustainable business. And my point 5, I've touched on this a bit. It's all about your people. And, you know, I can't stress that enough, in my opinion. It's all about the people you work with. And how can you help them become their better selves? And no, it's not all altruistic, because they improve, your business improves, your customers feel happier. We don't have much distinction between what we call our internal and external customers, and our internal being our team members. So focusing on people, particularly in a business like ours, but I think in every business, there's often so much lacking in people skills. And this takes me to point 6, giving and taking. Giving, karma, I'm a huge believer in it, and I've read quite a few books about this. And, you know, being a giving, sharing person, it does come back. And, you know, you meet so many people, I'm sad to say, whether in business or life, who at best they want to divide every cake exactly down the middle in half, or they want to get a slightly bigger piece than you. And I don't think it pays off in the long run. You might win some short victories and think it's clever, but this has been my experience. And again, I'm not trying to philosophize on what's right or wrong, but that's been my experience. And engendering that in our team and how we treat our customers and how we treat each other has been so, so important. And during this COVID-19, being, you know, 5 months away from the business, you know, I've been able to sleep at night knowing that our team are looking after the business to the best of their ability, and they've been, you know, nothing short of brilliant. And it's, you know, really touched me on lots of levels. And that's all about all about investing in your team in every sense. Learning, I don't need to say, but you know, asking questions and being curious and keep learning is something that I think is really important. And I just mentioned I did a very challenging EMBA, which nearly killed me. It was 2 years of travel and study, but a brilliant experience. Would I do it again? Probably not, because it nearly killed me. But it was a bit like a mental boot camp, which was probably due at that point. And finally, what I would say is, you know, what's the point in working if you're not enjoying it? I mean, it's really sad when, you know, I've got family members, extended family members who really don't care for what they do each day. And it's not a good situation. Obviously, it's easy to say that. We all have to be pragmatic and we have to make a living. But back to the, you know, earlier slides, there is sometimes a question of, do we have the balls to just get up and go for it? And it's amazing what's out there if you're willing to go through that one door and close it and open another one. Super, super exciting. So I think my time's up, but yeah, really appreciate, again, thank you to the Confucius Institutes and Giles and Francis and Tabio for helping host this. Pleasure to be talking. If there are any questions, love to hear them. And I think this is our management team at Happy Monk. This was for an opening party, so everyone was dressed up nicely that evening. And yeah, if anyone ever wants to get in touch, even just to bounce some ideas, or if you're interested in doing something in China, or you're interested in food and beverage, or restaurants, or bars, or anything, I love hearing from people. So just don't feel shy at all. So I think my time's up now, Giles, but thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy, for a very kind of personal perspective on your journey, but also lots of takeaways, because we've got people from lots of backgrounds and lots of angles tuning in here. We've got people who have graduated in Mandarin Chinese and are thinking about what to do next. We've got people who have lived and worked in China and are now back in the UK, and just people interested in China in general. I've been watching some of the questions come in the comment box, so I'll share some of those with you, Jeremy, and maybe you can pick up. First of all, there's a few questions coming through relating to the career development for graduates of Mandarin Chinese, and I'll just kind of give you a taste of some of these. First of all, Derek is asking, generally speaking, about the prospects for new graduates. What are the skills that are required in China, or that would be welcome in China? At the same time, he's also said, for living and operating in China successfully, how good does your Chinese have to be? How good does your Mandarin Chinese have to be? And just a couple of other career-related ones. James was asking that, looking at your direction of travel, you did this conversion course in law. Would you recommend this type of kind of conversion approach to get skills in order to develop a career? Was that very challenging, switching to another sort of discipline like that? And in the same vein, really, Amelia was asking, would it be a good idea, for example, to get skills here in the UK, career develop, well, new kind of knowledge, experience before going to China? Or is China something you can sort of just jump in after you graduate in Chinese? So a few kind of career related ones there, Jeremy, for you to just start on, if you can, please.
Sure, thanks for that, and thank you to everyone for those questions. Obviously, a lot of questions there, and I'll stress again, this is coming really very subjectively and just from my own observations, and I'm not an expert and I don't have the figures to hand. One thing I would say, which may sound a little bit negative, but you know, nowadays, being a foreigner with some Chinese language skills is great, but it's not that special. When I graduated, it was very special, and we all got snapped up. And that's why I mentioned in my talk, I got a training contract with a City of London firm, which I on paper should not have got. But that was through having the Chinese connection. The difference nowadays is, frankly, we're competing against millions of graduates in China, many of whom speak exceptionally good English nowadays. They picked up English so quickly over there. So that is definitely, that sounds a bit negative. However, what I would say is that if you are interested in China for a career, having Chinese makes a huge difference. And whether it's just on the day-to-day living level, being able to get around, to make friends, to earn people's respect, to understand society better, it's invaluable. I mean, if I didn't have Chinese, there's no way I'd be living in China. No way. I see my friends there who don't, and it's just not the same experience for them. And for me, I just wouldn't like it. In terms of, so I'm not saying having Chinese is no use. I encourage, in fact, my nieces in university in England, I've encouraged them, and one of them is now taking Chinese. But I think thinking beyond just the language capability, what is the area, what are the skills that you can acquire, and how and where do you acquire those? I think that's the question. And to be able to make a career in China, I guess there's essentially 2 or 3 routes. One is to become an English teacher, because nobody can compete with native English speakers, but it's not what everybody wants to do, obviously. The other is to get a job in a corporate. Not that easy, certainly in Guangzhou, for the reasons I've mentioned. I mean, there's lots of local graduates. The work visa situations probably got tougher, and they need a good reason to employ a non-Chinese person to get a work permit. So in a sort of general corporate type job, especially the lower level, not that easy. In terms of entrepreneurship and setting things up, I think there's 1,000,001 opportunities. I'm probably biased, but I think there are, and I see, you know, I've got friends from Israel, from India, from Germany, from the US, from all over, who are doing all sorts of things. Fitness. One of my friends has got a really successful online fitness platform. It's just growing every month. Another friend of mine from Israel started vegan food delivery. He's now got a vegan shop. He's now talking about a vegan restaurant. But this guy, you know, he's got that real kind of determination, and he's been chipping away at this for 3 or 4 years, and now it's starting to bear fruit. Back to what I was saying earlier. Another guy makes videos, and he's got into making, a British guy, videos for Chinese pop stars and music and bands and this type of thing. But again, he struggled, he lived and worked in a tiny, tiny little apartment, and he's put the years in. But now, you know, he was with one of Chinese biggest rock stars on the world tour, making a documentary. So these opportunities are there, but you need to work out, you know, where there are gaps in the market, like anywhere. So anything to do with social media. Again, this is what I think, just from my dealings with our business and working with the British Chamber and so on. Anything to do with online, social media, developing a social media platform, marketing, those types of skills, I think, are in big demand in China. And frankly, from what we can see, and we're very much a media type of, we're trying to attract young people to restaurants and bars and parties and so on. We really struggle finding people who know what they're doing in that space. And yes, you could go to one of the big agencies, but they charge an absolute fortune. It's not viable. So lifestyle stuff to do with travel, adventure travel, these types of sort of niche areas. But if you want to come to China and just compete head to head with everybody else, it's tough. It's going to be tough. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But I'd say keep the Chinese going. I'm going to do my HSK exams when I get back, if I ever get back. So I've got a teacher and I'm still studying, and you know what it's like, everyone who's studied Chinese, you never end, and it's a tough language, you have to keep chipping away. And even after a degree, even after I finished Leeds, you know, your Chinese is only, you've been learning 4 years, you've only gone to that level, you're nowhere near really fluent for most people. So the only way, it's just like attrition, but it's fun, you know, and I work with 100, like I said, nearly 200 colleagues, and they're all Chinese apart from me. And nearly everything we do is everything we do is in Chinese and some English too. But so I think don't be scared off by the China market, but just be smart and work out the niche and a plan to get into it. And lots and lots of opportunity for sure. It's plenty of opportunity, but not that easy to get, if that makes sense. And keep going with the language. Hope that helps a little bit, Giles. But
that's great. I've covered a wide range of options. I've got a couple of more broader questions as well coming through. Carol was asking more generally about your take on China's direction over the next few years. Chris was asking about advice for British companies in view of some recent developments. I mean, the introduction of the national security law in Hong Kong, for example, and also just general things really about dealing with China in what we hope will become a post-COVID world, but you know, owing to and after the kind of pandemic. What's your view on the broader picture?
Yeah, I mean that's a excellent question and a huge question. I mean, obviously at the moment the sort of geopolitical landscape isn't looking particularly friendly in lots of different directions. If you pick up the papers at the moment, even here in New Zealand. So things are tough in that respect, and you've got the US trade war and so on and so on. So I think, you know, I'd be lying if I said it doesn't affect China. Of course it does. I would also say that, you know, in the last 3 or 4 years in particular, as a society and as a system, China has become much, much stricter. And you know, the sort of, if you like, the freedoms that used to exist to some extent have been watered down in China. I mean, you know, whether it's censorship or, you know, government involvement in your business. And I don't mean it's all sinister, but just the degree of regulatory oversight has, up until this COVID at least, had gone up exponentially. So in our business, being in the bar restaurant business, we were dealing, in the last couple of years, we were dealing with this all the time. In the old days, you could kind of do whatever you wanted. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? That's probably a whole separate theme of a webinar. I mean, what I would say is that certainly things are being cleaned up. You know, the backhander environment that used to be everywhere is, looks like it's pretty much gone. Things are a lot more rules-based, and dealing with government, absolutely, things are much more black and white and straightforward. And there's definitely a sense of more, you know, even something like getting a driving license. To be honest, in the old days, anyone could kind of get a driving license and even get one of their friends to sit the test. I mean, it was like that. Nowadays, it's a 6-month process and everything done with facial recognition and no cheating and so on and so on. So I suppose that, you know, where's it all heading? Honestly, Giles, whoever asked those questions, I don't know. It's a big question. I do think about it. And some people would argue, well, Jeremy, it's a bit of a risk to put all your eggs in the China basket. Probably true to some extent. But then people have got it wrong all along in the last 20 years about where China's heading and what's going to happen. So I've kind of given up trying to predict that. But certainly on a day-to-day level, ignoring the politics and geopolitics, but on a day-to-day operating level, running a business in China, as I said a bit earlier in the talk, you know, dealing with ethical business people in terms of whether it's your landlords, your suppliers, your colleagues and so on, things have definitely improved a huge amount. And it feels like a much more sort of sophisticated environment. And there's definitely a sense of, you know, young people are very, like I said, entrepreneurial. One great thing about running a bar in China is people are so curious. You know, if you brought a new cocktail onto the menu, I mean, literally, you know, in the Western world, you get this sort of cynicism, oh yeah, been there, done that. But in China, but particularly because it's new and things are changing, it just makes it very, it just makes it very exciting and fun when you put a new cocktail on the menu and you see everyone buying it and trying it and taking photos and posting it and talking about it, kind of thing. And that makes working and living in China really, really fun. You know, I love that aspect of it. Sort of the younger generation and the aspirations and making life better. And, you know, at the end of the day, I believe that young people around the world are pretty much the same and want the same things in the world and in life. You know, you're seeing now, you know, they just banned eating cats and dogs in SHENZHEN. Now, without getting into the ethics of eating cats and dogs, but for me personally, I thought that was a positive step. People are talking about this kind of thing. You know, the LGBT scene is growing. You know, we host parties in our bars for the LGBT and for different kind of groups. And, you know, there's quite an open-mindedness and acceptance. And that's also something refreshing. Something that, you know, if you don't go to China and you don't know anything about China and you just rely on sort of what you read in the papers, you know, you don't really get that sense. We had a couple of Kiwis. So actually one of our suppliers who supplies mussels from New Zealand, who's become quite a good friend. So his 17 and 19-year-old sons came for December to come and kind of do an internship with us. And, you know, they were just blown away. I mean, they said, you know, we came to China thinking we could drink all the young people under the table, but boy, we were so badly proven wrong. So, so I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but so I guess optimism, but there is this, you know, the clouds of the geopolitics and sustainability of the system and all these things. That's probably a different talk, but at the moment it feels pretty lively and fairly straightforward getting things done. Okay,
thank you, Jeremy. We've just got time, like a minute or two, for some quick fire questions that came through the comments as well. Some going back to some earlier points. So if you could give some quick answers to those, and then we could sort of wind up. Callum was asking, therefore, do you recommend a top-up law degree to? I mean, and there was another question here.
Oh, yeah, that was the question earlier.
Yeah. Do you have any regrets about the law degree? I mean, in terms of what it's brought to you and your success. So just a quick thing about law, whether it's a good thing to do.
I'll be very frank. I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to go back to study. And I didn't want to work in a boring law office, is what I felt when I started. But there was something inside saying, it's about time. I mean, by this stage, I was in my late 20s. It's about time to do something respectable. That's why I sort of forced myself over the line into it. In hindsight, again, you know, I talked about these defining moments. That was a defining moment. And I'm so glad I did it. And for me personally, working in law in China, well, firstly, if you do it, you get a professional qualification. Like it or not, people take you more seriously. You can get a job with a higher salary if you say I'm an accountant, a lawyer, a doctor, or this or that. That's the way the world is, unfortunately. Secondly, you've got something to fall back on and something which is a tangible skill. So, you know, just having done China law in terms of helping with my business now, all the employment stuff, all the contracts we do, all the negotiations, I don't need to involve outside lawyers, the trademark stuff and what have you. So it's been really, really beneficial. And I think, so my simple answer is I would thoroughly recommend anyone who's sort of at that crossroads, if they can get a professional qualification of some description, you know, in something, could be in social media development. I would, if I was talking to my younger brother, I'd say just go for it. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, it's gone so quickly, this 1 hour, but we've run out of time. I'd like to try to keep to time. So I think I covered most of the questions coming through on comments. Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing your insight and experience.
Pleasure.
It's been fantastic. Thank you to our partners at University of Manchester Confucius Institute. And thank you all for joining. We have posted the feedback response link in the comments section. If you could go in and give us your feedback, that would be really helpful. And finally, we look forward to staying in touch with you all and inviting us to our future events. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Thanks, Giles. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks.
Thanks, Francis.
Thanks.
Great. So excellent. So we'll check the form to see feedback, and thank you for those comments as well coming through in the chat. We've got a recording of this as well, so we'll be able to share that in our follow-up. So I think, TAIPEI, shall we go ahead and end the meeting?
Yes.
All right. Thanks, everyone.